Seo Young-min is a diligent taxi driver and a man of integrity. One morning, after preparing breakfast for his grandmother, he was about to start his day when he found a phone in his car. Assuming it was left by a passenger, he picked it up, but a strange energy surged through him, and the phone fell. Confused, Young-min didn't notice a woman appearing and then vanishing in the back seat. A man then approached him, revealing that Young-min had unpaid bank loans, putting his house at risk of foreclosure. He owed 20 million won in interest alone, with a principal of 100 million. He was informed that he had one last chance to pay the 20 million by the end of the month to avoid foreclosure. While worrying about this, Young-min heard strange noises from the radio and saw a girl in white appear behind him. He stopped the car, only to realize he had picked up 4 actors dressed as ghosts. Relieved after the woman said she would get off, Young-min turned around to find her walking slowly forward. Seemingly unable to leave the car. The next day, Young-min thought it was all a nightmare, but the woman was still in the car. After a scream, he ran out, and the woman followed, but soon vanished. Trying to avoid a parking ticket, Young-min had a man confirm no one was in the car before sitting back down, yet the woman was still there. She claimed to have no memory of her past and suspected Young-min was her killer. After proving his innocence through surveillance footage and trying to drive her out, she remained tied to the car. Young-min continued his work with her in the car, but passengers felt uneasy and left. With no business done, his financial problems worsened. Young-min threatened to charge the ghost for the ride and decided to find her family to demand payment. At the police station, no matching records were found, so he took her home. After a day without income, he scolded her for lacking empathy and left. The woman stared at the license plate, lost in thought. Young-min had not worked for 2 days, and his driving was distracted by her presence, leading to a minor accident. To rid himself of the ghost, Young-min sought a shaman's help. The shaman scattered red beans, unexpectedly unlocking a new skill for the woman. As the shaman shook the bell, the woman felt anxious and suddenly teleported next to Young-min. Young-min then realized he had been deceived. As his phone rang, he had no choice but to take her to pick up an important passenger. Strangely, this passenger seemed unaffected by her presence, suggesting that only those with weak energy feel discomfort. Upon arrival, the woman discovered the passenger was a doctor. Back at home, after much pleading from the woman, Young-min agreed to park the car at the doorstep, provided she did not enter the house. After he left, the woman sat alone on the car roof, comforted by the light, and felt unafraid that night. Meanwhile, Young-min started posting on forums seeking advice. One reply caught his attention, warning him to be cautious as she might attract other spirits. The poster was named Hua Gongjia from Cheongdam-dong. This realization made Young-min shudder, but he couldn't afford to be scared, as he needed to earn money to save his house. A passenger waved from the roadside, and Young-min quickly went to pick him up. The man looked surprisingly pleased, and without a word, crossed through the car to the back seat. Young-min was stunned. It was another spirit. With no choice left, he continued working with 2 spirits, but the car felt overwhelmingly gloomy. A man just opening the car door felt a sudden ache in his back and left immediately, ruining any chance of business. To end it all, Young-min decided to sell the car, but the 2 spirits desperately tried to stop him. Young-min was determined to distance himself from them. At that moment, a man called out to the woman. Before she could react, he walked through the car toward her. He explained that his child was sick, and he had planned to sell his gold savings when he had a car accident. His unsuspecting wife sold the car while his child was in the hospital. With Young-min's help, the gold finally returned to his family. Tears filled the woman's eyes as she saw the gold. The man bowed in gratitude to the 3 of them, and then vanished. Soon after, a little girl approached Young-min and handed him a gold ring. On the way back, the woman suggested keeping the taxi to continue earning money, even if it meant only transporting spirits. Thinking of the gold ring he had just earned, Young-min was tempted. To pay off his huge debt, he started a taxi service exclusively for spirits and quickly made a lot of money. Not only did he clear his debts, but he also achieved financial freedom with his grandmother. However, reality struck hard when he visited the home of Kim Byung-cheol and discovered that this spirit was not wealthy. Seeing Young Min's disappointment, Kim Byung-cheol quickly mentioned that he had gold bars hidden at home worth 2 million won. His wife, who often stood all day due to her job, was supposed to get a bathtub for a better rest, but he became a spirit before it could be installed. Angry at their deceit, Young Min wanted no part in helping and left without looking back. Back home, the woman tried to argue, but Young Min immediately lost his temper. Once home, the woman followed him inside. She felt pity for Kim Byung-cheol, who had died only 3 months after getting married. Just then, his grandmother walked in and asked Young Min whom he was talking to. He lied about being on the phone. His grandmother asked him to fix the toilet's pipes. Remembering the bathtub, Young Min recalled his own past desire for one, promised by his mother. This memory softened his heart, and he stepped out only to find the woman sleeping on the sofa. The next day, Young Min visited Kim Byung-cheol's home again. Kim Byung-cheol confirmed that he indeed had gold bars. It turned out that his 10th anniversary with his wife was approaching. He wanted to buy a special gift for her, so he hadn't told her about the money. To ensure the plan's implementation, Mr. Zhang shared his story with them. It turned out that he and his wife met in an orphanage and had been good friends ever since. Unexpectedly, fate brought them together again as adults. During that time, they were both hardworking and happy. Seeing her hands peeling from work, Kim Byung-cheol handed her some medicine. She accepted his gesture gratefully. Over the next 10 years, they only had eyes for each other. Unexpectedly, Kim Byung-cheol passed away 3 months after their marriage. Following this, Young Min, pretending to be Kim Byung-cheol's junior, visited his wife's home. He falsely claimed that Kim Byung-cheol had asked him to help install a bathtub and asked the wife to fetch the house rental contract. Seizing the opportunity, Kim Byung-cheol and Young Min headed to the bedroom to find the gold bars. Meanwhile, a woman was observing the wife's every move. As the wife brought out the contract, the woman shouted a reminder. The two returned to the living room, having successfully retrieved the gold bars at the last moment. Just as they were celebrating, a phone call plunged the wife into despair. Her husband's death had resulted in an insurance payout of 300 million Korean won. Just as she was about to sign the documents, a woman suddenly rushed in crying, fell to the floor, and continuously called out Kim Byung-cheol's name. Kim Byung-cheol, who had been an orphan for nearly 40 years, was confused, unaware that he had a mother. A man beside him presented proof of her identity. His mother expressed her guilt, explaining she hadn't abandoned her son because she was in prison at the time. She then pulled out several bank books from her bag, which she had been saving in as an expression of her remorse. Among them was a photo of Kim Byung-cheol as a child. It became clear she was indeed his mother. She cried again, repeatedly apologizing. The trio deeply believed her act. Subsequently, they visited a columbarium where his mother placed kiwi fruits on a plate, claiming they were her son's favorite. Kim Byung-cheol, confused, mentioned he was allergic to kiwi fruits, casting doubt in Young Min's mind. After discovering the pair wasn't legally married, his mother's demeanor changed when told they were extending their newlywed period to qualify for a housing discount. As they prepared to leave, the wife received a call from her manager. Her mother-in-law was about to receive all the insurance money. Shocked, the wife quoted legal provisions that only legally recognized spouses could collect the money, though de facto relationships were recognized for state compensation. Confused as she had amnesia, she wondered how she knew this. They hurriedly followed the wife, who questioned her mother-in-law's actions. Kim Byung-cheol became angry, declaring he would be better off without such a mother. Young Min's suspicions deepened. In the car, the two laughed joyously, revealing that the real mother and the woman were prison mates, and the stories were fabricated to claim the insurance money. Meanwhile, Young Min drove his wife home. On the way, the woman sympathized with Kim Byung-cheol. His mother, who abandoned him, took all the money while his lover of 10 years received nothing. Suddenly, Young Min stopped the car to tighten a banner on the roadside seeking witnesses to a hit and run, which puzzled the woman. Back home, Young Min expressed his suspicions. He is also allergic to kiwis. When he was sick as a child, his mother was very worried. His parents would never make such a simple mistake. The passbook only contained 30 million won, which was a great deal for 300 million won. The woman agreed with him completely. He must have been very close to his mother, which is why he noticed. Young Min said his mother had died 3 months ago in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident. He was the one who hung the banner, and the police still had no suspects. He arrived at the address of Kim Byung-cheol's mother, but ringing the doorbell elicited no response. Looking at the door's keypad, Young Min suddenly thought of Kim Byung-cheol's birthday and tried entering it as the code. The door surprisingly opened. The house was a mess, clearly burglarized. He only found a photo there. Kim Byung-cheol had forgotten what his mother looked like, only remembering the scar on her right hand. Following this, Young Min shared his suspicions with his wife, thinking that his current mother was an imposter. To confirm, his manager called his mother to the office under the pretext of needing her fingerprint for urgent documents. It was a mother-son verification document. With no escape, she had to remove her glove, revealing a scar on her hand. However, the real scar of his mother was on the right hand. Young Min immediately removed her glove, only to find a scar there too. His mother found it strange, but pressed her fingerprint anyway. The manager was stunned upon seeing that the fingerprint was completely worn off due to rough work, making verification impossible. Accidentally speaking out loud, his mother realized they were suspecting her. She got angry, thinking it was definitely the wife causing trouble behind the scenes, and even accused Young Min of having an improper relationship with her. Seeing no point in hiding, his wife admitted she just wanted to confirm her identity. His mother, energized, pulled out some hair and threw it on the table, challenging them to do a DNA test. She knew her daughter-in-law had disposed of all the heirlooms and felt emboldened by the absence of evidence. This clearly laid everything out, but his wife was helpless and fainted on the spot. When she woke up, the doctor informed her she was pregnant, which shocked her as she had been diagnosed infertile. The doctor told her that just as misfortune can strike unexpectedly, miracles can also happen when least expected. She was overjoyed. However, the law strictly prohibits DNA testing on unborn children as it poses a risk to the fetus. Upon hearing this, she immediately decided against it. Just then, his mother came over, still suspicious of the relationship between Young Min and his wife, even suspecting the child wasn't Kim Byung-cheol's. Enraged, his mother persisted, but Young Min quickly intervened, assuring her he would uncover the whole matter. For the sake of the child, his wife decided to swallow the bitter pill and give up the fight for the insurance money. Although they were reluctant, the only thing they could do was help fulfill Kim Byung-cheol's wishes by installing a bathtub for his wife. The woman thanked Young Min, who not only heard the words of a spirit, but also kindly extended his help. Young Min suddenly realized why she was in his room. The next day, Young Min brought his friend to his wife's house to install the bathtub. The woman suddenly saw a photo on the table. On the day of signing, 2 con artists arrived at the scene. But just as she was about to sign, Young Min interrupted her. The paper was the genetic test report between her and Kim Byung-cheol. This woman was not Kim Byung-cheol's biological mother and had no right to the insurance. Kim Byung-cheol had applied for a DNA storage card, and the woman's DNA sample was the hair she had cut off earlier. His wife threatened to call the police, and the 2 con artists quickly fled. Young Min chased after him. The man pushed the patient directly onto him. From there, it was up to the police. A gust of wind blew. Young Min was spellbound watching the woman. The air was filled with the scent of love, yet the object of affection was a long-dead spirit. Now, Kim Byung-cheol had fulfilled his wish. When they high-fived each other for their understanding, the woman fell right through him and onto the ground. He looked down, suddenly noticing the hair tie on the woman's hand. He then took his wife home, but upon reaching the doorstep, his wife sensed something was amiss. Why was the door open? As Young Min prepared to drive home, he suddenly found his wife's forgotten bag, containing 30 million won from a swindler. Just as they puzzled over it, Kim Byung-cheol ran down in a panic. Realizing something was wrong, Young Min hurried upstairs. After Kim Byung-cheol entered the password, he went through the door. Although Young Min opened the door, a safety lock kept him outside. Hearing the noise, the man inside made a threat. "If you want to have this baby smoothly, quickly tell us where the passbook is." His wife said she left it in a taxi. The old woman didn't believe her. Desperate outside, Young Min panicked as he saw the man pull out a knife. His wife pleaded for the lives of herself and her unborn child. How could Kim Byung-cheol bear to see his wife harmed? Even now, as a spirit, he wanted to help his wife. He smashed the safety lock, persisting despite his body passing through it. Eventually, Young Min entered the room and swiftly dealt with the scum. The police arrived and arrested them. By now, Kim Byung-cheol decided to come clean to his wife. Young Min acted as a go-between, relaying that Kim Byung-cheol had sent him, and he was sitting right beside him. His wife couldn't believe her deceased husband had saved her in a moment of crisis. Kim Byung-cheol mentioned their stargazing, leaving his wife frozen, as only the two of them knew about it. Back then, they had agreed to name their child Little Star, though his wife had found it tacky at the time. Now she fully believed Young Min's words, convinced her deceased husband was beside her. Kim Byung-cheol wished for their child to be named Little Star so he could continue to watch over them from the heavens. Tears in her eyes, his wife agreed. Kim Byung-cheol apologized, once again leaving his wife alone. He was truly sorry. Kim Byung-cheol finally completed his farewell, thanking them both before his body became transparent, and after one last look at his wife, he vanished into specks of starlight within the room. This is the meaning of the spirit taxi. If Kim Byung-cheol hadn't protected his wife, he would have blamed himself, unable to leave this world. Listening to the wishes of spirits and helping them fulfill their desires is something only Young Min can do. A drunkard blocked the taxi. The woman quickly shifted to the back seat. After the man stated his destination, Young Min was focused on driving when the drunkard curiously glanced at him, groaned, and suddenly lost consciousness. When he looked up again, his eyes emitted a blue light, his fingers creeping onto Young Min's leg. The woman widened her eyes. Before Young Min could react, the man's hand moved higher, smirking as he prepared his next move. Another hand pressed down on it, suppressing the left hand after a struggle. Young Min then pulled over. The drunkard tried to escape, but Young Min called out to him, realizing he too could see spirits. The realization struck the drunkard, blurring the line between the living and the dead due to his intoxication. Both were incredulous. The drunkard suddenly remembered a forum discussion about the combination of taxis and spirits. He was Hua Gongjia from Cheongdam-dong, who believed spirits were selfish and should leave the living quickly. He said he would help Young Min get rid of the ghost. He pulled out a talisman and pressed it onto the taxi. It had no effect. He then put the talisman on Young Min's head. Still the same result. It seems Young Min picked up something unlucky. Hua Gongjia resorted to drastic measures, walking toward the woman with the talisman in hand. The woman could only ask Young Min for help. Realizing the situation, Young Min quickly subdued him. Hua Gongjia repeatedly begged for mercy. Only then did Young Min let him go. Still uneasy, he handed Young Min his business card. The woman glared at him with hate. After Hua Gongjia left, Young Min started to examine the items possessed by the woman. All 4 items were left in the car by customers. Young Min picked up a book and walked into the distance, exceeding her range of movement. Clearly, the book was not it. Young Min then picked up a cell phone nearby. He hadn't gone far when the woman sensed something was wrong. The next second, she flew straight at Young Min. Her first kiss was suddenly stolen. Young Min was terrified and clueless, but the woman couldn't stop smiling. It seemed like she had gained something. On the way home, Young Min couldn't take his eyes off her red lips, the incident leaving a lasting impression. After coming to his senses, the woman realized the cell phone wasn't hers because it was too old. Just as Young Min stepped out of the car, the woman sensed something unusual. Kang Ji-hyun had possessed the cell phone after her death. The moment the cell phone ran out of battery, she disappeared on the spot. She found herself in a dark, otherworldly place, a towering stone forest with an abyss below. The surrounding columns kept collapsing. She was truly terrified. Mr. Driver was her only hope of escaping. Young Min realized this and went to buy a charger, but the phone model was too old. After visiting several stores without success, a customer got into the car. A friend even paid the fare for him. After some thought, Young Min took the ride. With no ghostly aura, the customer felt no discomfort. As the man got out, another woman got in. Business was unusually good today. It had been a long time since Young Min had done genuine business. He made quite a bit of money that night. The car stopped in front of his house. Young Min was torn between continuing with the ghost taxi or returning to his old life. The next day, young Min tried to borrow a charger from his grandmother, only to find the connector didn't fit. Reluctantly, he left the house, consoling himself that the absence of the annoying ghost was actually a good thing. As soon as he took out the cell phone, his grandmother saw it. Young Min explained that he planned to throw it away. Today, his grandmother had a singing class. Young Min drove her to the destination. Unexpectedly, his grandmother took the phone, and when Young Min noticed, she was already at the phone recycling box. Young Min hurriedly chased after her, but it was already too late. There was nothing more he could do. He took another customer to the seaside, where everyone looked like Ji-hyun to him. Young Min felt he was going insane. That evening, while dining with a friend, a female colleague suddenly showed up. Her mother, who had Alzheimer's, was missing. They hurriedly helped look for her, but found no trace. The colleague told Young Min her mother was like a ghost to others, invisible because she didn't remember who she was. Only she could see and find her mother, knowing who she was. Her words deeply stung Young Min. The phone rang. Her mother was at the police station at that moment. She rushed there. On Young Min's return journey, he felt empty as he looked at the passenger seat. The woman was still waiting. A ghost wrapped in a bundle appeared next to her, glanced at the woman, then walked toward the abyss. Lightning roared around her. Perhaps she, too, would soon vanish. That night, Young Min was lost in thought for a very long time. The next day, he asked the staff to open the box. At the moment he retrieved his phone, Young Min seemed to have found himself again. He searched through mobile shops everywhere but still could not find a charger for that model. Eventually, he had to turn to the internet. A woman lay on the cold stone, her heart dead. Just as she despaired, Young Min charged the phone. Suddenly, her body vanished, and she returned to reality. Looking up, she found herself lying in Young Min's arms. A strange woman stood by the road. People in the car initially did not care, but after driving a distance, the woman appeared again ahead. The taxi passed her once more, and the female ghost appeared again in front. Unable to avoid her, Young Min decided to take up this business. Ji-hyun quickly hid. Young Min stopped the car beside her. The ghost wore no expression, and then teleported to the back seat. Young Min drove towards the destination. The ghost was not well behaved and mentioned a famous ghost story to Young Min. Ji-hyun shivered in the corner. Seeing that Young Min was not panicked, the ghost decided to scare him. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward. She had no choice but to sit back down. It must be said, as a ghost, she really failed. Finally reaching the destination, Young Min asked her for the fare. Not only did she not want to pay, but she also wanted to show Young Min the terror of ghosts. Young Min preferred money over life. Whether alive or dead did not matter. As long as the fare was paid, it was enough. Thinking he could not catch her, she thought of running away without paying. But Ji-hyun pulled her back. Upon learning she had no money, Ji-hyun argued with her on the spot. Young Min was burdened with huge loans. Every penny was crucial for him. The woman then realized this was a taxi service for ghosts. Knowing they had been struggling to find clients, she decided to exchange information for the fare. After she vanished, another woman in red appeared behind them. She led them to a bus stop, saying it was a gathering place for ghosts. The woman told them to come back during the day. If she spread the word about the ghost taxi, surely many ghosts would come. The next morning, Ji-hyun went to the bedroom. After waking Young Min, she smiled sweetly. Skeptical, they went to last night's bus stop. Indeed, many ghosts had gathered there. Both were extremely happy. Countless bills seemed to beckon them. Both were highly motivated. Ji-hyun, exceptionally enthusiastic, asked the ghosts to line up. She decided to help them one by one with their wishes. But the first one was a challenge. A woman wanted to visit her son in America. That was indeed far. An old lady wished to return to Korea, but they could not cross the demilitarized zone. As they happily selected, a bespectacled ghost approached. He stared at Ji-hyun, immediately recognizing her. Ji-hyun looked puzzled. It was the first time she heard her name. The man said he was Kim Sin-woo, her high school classmate, and mentioned she used to practice kendo and had been seriously injured during a competition. At the time, it had scared him. Ji-hyun, who had amnesia, did not remember any of this. She was thrilled to have finally found a clue about her identity. Kim Sin-woo mentioned he still has photos from high school. Ji-hyun was so excited that she spun around. The two followed him into the store. It had not been in business since his death. Young Min helped him retrieve the photos. One woman caught her attention. She was the ghost they had encountered in the stone forest. Kim Sin-woo said she was his best friend, but now she didn't remember at all. Upon learning Ji-hyun and Young Min were not a couple, Kim Sin-woo finally relaxed. He said they had much to talk about and asked Young Min to bring chairs for them. Then he had Young Min clean up. Young Min asked why he was helping. Only then did Kim Sin-woo remember he hadn't paid. He opened the safe and, to his surprise, found a stack of cash. Kim Sin-woo then shared his wish list: watching a movie and dining out with his first love, proposing with a ring. His love interest was indeed Young Min's Ji-hyun. He felt it was fate. Young Min was stunned, watching them chat so happily. He looked visibly displeased. On the way home, Ji-hyun was particularly reflective. Now that she knew her name, she greedily wanted to learn more. Young Min decided to take her to their high school. Ji-hyun was overjoyed, but here she only saw a championship trophy. Seeing a somewhat disappointed Ji-hyun, Young Min felt pity. He started searching online for information about Ji-hyun. Before he knew it, it was late into the night. The next day, he went to Cheongdam-dong to find Hwa Gong-ja, consulting him about ghostly matters. He even took one of his mirrors before leaving. Ji-hyun finally saw her own face. Young Min then tried changing her clothes, and it surprisingly worked, though the outfit was quite ugly. The next day, they went shopping at the mall. Young Min bought clothes for both of them, and afterwards he complained to Hwang Mao about his recent moodiness, feeling annoyed for no reason. Hwang Mao pointed out that he must have fallen for someone. The ghost's first wish was to have a movie date alone with Ji-hyun. Instead, Young Min took him to the rooftop, turning it into a private cinema with a projector. Currently, Young Min was the only one who could help him. As a ghost, Kim Sin-woo was angry but dared not speak up. Ji-hyun arrived there, watching the two enjoy the movie. Young Min felt very uncomfortable. He put down his phone and left. Ji-hyun, looking at the phone, also felt uneasy, feeling somewhat abandoned. Until the movie ended, Young Min returned, only to hear Kim Sin-woo's confession. Young Min scoffed at this. Turning around, he saw Ji-hyun staring at him. Kim Sin-woo's second wish was a dinner date at a fancy restaurant. So, Young Min took him home instead. Facing his complaints, Young Min felt helpless. He couldn't possibly go to a restaurant, order 3 meals, and sit there cutting steak alone. Ji-hyun thought this place was nice. Kim Sin-woo quickly agreed. Young Min played music on his phone. Kim Sin-woo then complained about the lack of a sound system. Before he could react, Grandma made a grand entrance. Kim Sin-woo was dumbfounded. How could he have a date now? Though they couldn't eat, they sniffed the red wine. Seeing the two acting intimately, Young Min couldn't contain his anger. So he had Grandma sing a song. Ji-hyun's attention was immediately captured. She was very supportive. Kim Sin-woo, however, was impatient. He started flirting, complimenting Ji-hyun's beautiful hands and claiming to be good at palmistry. He then started touching her hand. Young Min was seething with jealousy. On the way to take Kim Sin-woo home, he talked about his next wish, which was to make couple rings. Young Min couldn't understand. After all, once his wishes were fulfilled, he would disappear. What was the point of a ring? Kim Sin-woo hurriedly told him, if ghosts successfully date, they go to heaven together. Young Min was suddenly panicked. Sitting in the car, Ji-hyun teleported next to him. Young Min asked her how she felt about Kim Sin-woo. A jealous Young Min told her, now that she knew her name and was with a handsome guy, leaving would be good. Ji-hyun felt very uneasy. She asked him if he really wanted her to leave. Kim Sin-woo wants to date her. Young Min never asked for her opinion. She tolerated Young Min's decisions because they run a ghost taxi that fulfills wishes. The date was not her choice. Now, Young Min blames her for it. Ji-hyun disappeared sadly. Young Min realized his mistake. The next day, Young Min bought matching rings. On his way to Kim Sin-woo's house, he thought about Kim Sin-woo's confession and them walking to heaven hand in hand. Young Min couldn't accept it. He turned around. Ji-hyun sensed something was wrong. She quickly reminded Young Min that if Kim Sin-woo spread negative news, their ghost taxi business would be ruined. Young Min didn't listen and floored the accelerator.
이미 망했다고요. 좋아하니까.
The man just got home when a beautiful woman appeared out of nowhere. She blocked his way, swaying her long legs, not letting him pass. The man clenched his teeth and walked through her. Young Min lay depressed in bed, unable to believe he fell in love with a ghost, his own Ji-hyun. Then Ji-hyun teleported in, complaining about abandoning the ghost taxi and earning money, leaving customers hanging. Now, Young Min was pretending to be dead in bed. After her complaint, Ji-hyun vanished angrily. Young Min got up to look for her, and Ji-hyun appeared behind him. Young Min didn't know how to face her, so he left the house alone. Ji-hyun anxiously waited at home with her grandmother until midnight, when Young Min had not returned. She wanted her grandmother to call Young Min. As if sensing it, her grandmother immediately called him. At that moment, Young Min was hiding in a bathhouse, saying he wouldn't come home, and then hung up. As he prepared to sleep, a man lay behind him and touched him suggestively, making the atmosphere tense. When the hand was about to reach his chest, Young Min sat up sharply. The man also backed away as if waking from a dream, recognizing him as Hwa Gong-ja. It must be the general causing trouble using his body again. Hwa Gong-ja quickly apologized, noticing Ji-hyun was not around and realizing there was trouble between them. Hwa Gong-ja told Young Min that two ghosts in love could indeed find release together, which was good for ghosts. Young Min urgently stopped him. Hwa Gong-ja warned Young Min never to fall in love with a ghost, as only souls with deep resentments become ghosts, and she had also lost her memory. Young Min didn't come home the next day. His grandmother couldn't reach him by phone, so she thought of contacting Jo-ri, as they had a good relationship, and she had always wanted to match them. Now was a good opportunity. Ji-hyun panicked when she heard they were together, unhappy about the situation. No wonder he hadn't come home all night. There was another woman with him. Her phone, which she possessed, was out of charge. Ji-hyun got angry, accusing the man of neglecting his duties for love. Just then, Young Min remembered his phone was uncharged and hurried home. Ji-hyun was quietly waiting for him. Young Min quickly charged the phone. Ji-hyun sarcastically commented on how different it is to meet a woman, looking pleased with himself. Young Min didn't say much because he had decided to follow Hwa Gong-ja's advice and say his final goodbye to Ji-hyun. The clothes he wore were Ji-hyun's favorite, now set to be a final gift. While on their date, Young Min called his friend, admitting he truly loved that woman, but she was about to go far away. His friend asked if he was letting go of the relationship, advising him not to live with regret. Being dumped after confessing and not confessing at all are different things. Young Min looked up at the building, unwilling to lose Ji-hyun, and decided to keep her. Both have now become ghosts. If the woman is willing to accept his love, they could ascend to heaven together. However, the woman decides to stay behind to help Young Min recover her lost memories. Seeing her determination, Kim Sin-woo warns her, "There's no future for a ghost and a human. If you truly want to regain your memories, you must not fall in love with Young Min." Kim Sin-woo continues, "Going on a date with my first love was my wish, and now it has been fulfilled." Before Ji-hyun understands what's happening, Young Min rushes over, thinking Ji-hyun was about to disappear with Kim Sin-woo. Unable to let go, he decides to confess his love, but he is too late. Kim Sin-woo disappears right before him. Young Min closes his eyes, unwilling to face reality, but Ji-hyun does not disappear. At this point, Young Min keeps his feelings to himself. To help Ji-hyun regain her memories, Young Min takes her to meet Hwa Gong-ja. He directly pulls out the phone possessed by Ji-hyun, then takes out a talisman. Ji-hyun is terrified, thinking Young Min is about to destroy her soul. Just as the talisman is about to be placed on the phone, Ji-hyun's powers suddenly erupt, and the talisman falls into the water. Hwa Gong-ja, distressed, retrieves it, having spent a lot of money on this talisman. Seeing Ji-hyun's reproachful look, Young Min quickly explains, "The talisman isn't meant to destroy you, it's to help restore your memory." Ji-hyun is then reassured. She places the talisman on her forehead. Outside the car, Young Min also harbors doubts about why the talisman flew away. Hwa Gong-ja warns him, "It's not good for a ghost to have power. Turning into an evil spirit can happen in an instant." Memories continuously emerge in her mind. After her best friend, who was pregnant, passed away, to uncover the truth, she goes to a detective agency called GB. Following the memories, they arrive only to find it closed. Young Min promises to find the detective for clarity. Ji-hyun is deeply moved. The detective used to call her cop, suggesting Ji-hyun might have been a police officer, possibly linked to her death involving crime or something sinister. While they are puzzled, a young boy gets into the taxi. To find his missing sister, the boy rides in a taxi for ghosts. He can see Ji-hyun, the ghost, and knows the taxi helps ghosts fulfill their wishes. The boy says his sister is missing, the police suggesting she might have run away, which is impossible as she would never forget his birthday the day before. The taxi becomes his only hope. Initially reluctant, young Min softens at the sight of two pleading eyes. He takes the boy home. The note on the wall shows the sister was diligent and meticulous. The room is clean and decorated with numerous certificates. The boy says his sister and grandmother were very close, ruling out the possibility of her running away. Her disappearance must have another explanation. The boy had wanted a gaming console for his birthday gift. They visit a store where the owner confirms the sister did buy a console, accompanied by a short-haired girl. From the owner's description, the boy identifies her as Sister Ga-eun, who frequently visited their home. Though he doesn't know Ga-eun's phone number, he knows the supermarket where Ga-eun and his sister worked together. The boss warmly welcomes the boy, and under Ji-hyun's guidance, the boy skillfully pressures the boss, who agrees to call Ga-eun, but she doesn't answer. The next day, young Min goes to the sister's school and manages to stop Ga-eun before school starts. 3 classmates also arrive, busy taking photos and posting on social media. Ga-eun appears uneasy. Ji-hyun senses something is off. The atmosphere among these people is awkward. Young Min inquires about the boy's sister's whereabouts from Ga-eun. Meanwhile, a girl named Choi Mira keeps interrupting, seemingly afraid Ga-eun might slip up. Ji-hyun also noticed something fishy. Several people mentioned that the boy's sister had been acting strangely lately. Her grades had suddenly plummeted. Rumors were that she was mixing with boys, and even gossip suggested she was making money through deals. A girl nearby even pulled out a photo as proof. Ji-hyun saw Ga-eun's panic. She definitely knew something. Young Min told everyone else to stay out of it and asked Ga-eun what exactly happened on the day she bought the game console. Ga-eun, panicking, stood up and left the scene directly. It turned out that day they had witnessed the boy's sister's death. Ga-eun wanted to call the police, but Choi Mira stopped her. A girl was showing off the latest makeup products. A clerk suddenly appeared behind her, opening a black plastic bag containing alcohol and cigarettes, which she was too young to handle. Ga-eun looked at her with sympathy. The bullied girl trembled with fear. Choi Mira disliked Ga-eun's look, so she warned her. If Ga-eun didn't want to continue playing this role, she shouldn't pity her. Ga-eun quickly averted her gaze. Ji-hyun, standing aside, noticed the trickery. She teleported back to the car and shared her suspicions with young Min. Ga-eun was working at the supermarket to deliver alcohol and cigarettes to Choi Mira. The disappearance of the boy's sister was also linked to Choi Mira. While discussing, they spotted Ga-eun preparing to go home and followed her by car. Choi Mira saw this. Young Min stopped Ga-eun, hoping she would disclose the whereabouts of the boy's sister. Just as Ga-eun was about to leave, the boy's voice came from behind. Ga-eun eventually got into a ghost taxi. However, as a spirit, Ji-hyun's aura was too heavy, making Ga-eun feel very uncomfortable until the boy comforted her by holding her hand. The boy asked Ga-eun about his family. Heartbroken, he told her that his grandmother had been suffering since his sister's disappearance. Young Min knew she was worried about Mira's threats and reassured her. This place was absolutely safe, and she could chat freely without worrying about others. The boy also asked if Ga-eun knew of his sister's whereabouts. Ga-eun felt ashamed, just as she was about to reveal the truth, when Mira suddenly called. Following the address provided by Ga-eun, they arrived at the location. A man appeared from behind, asking if he was the boy's uncle. Upon young Min's confirmation, 2 men armed with weapons appeared. Looking at the arrogant trio, Ji-hyun wanted young Min to retreat, but the 3 were no match for him. One man said he shouldn't mess with Choi Mira and swung a stick at him. Young Min initially managed it easily, but his phone suddenly flew out of his pocket. To protect his phone, young Min had to passively endure the beating. The man noticed this weakness and targeted the phone. Fortunately, young Min blocked it with his arm. At a critical moment, 2 passing policemen appeared and quickly subdued the trio. Young Min then realized that Ga-eun had stopped the police car. On the way to the hospital, Ji-hyun scolded him for being too impulsive. How could he confront a baseball bat? What if it hit his head? She pushed a poor female classmate down, sighed heavily while flipping her hair, and looked extremely arrogant. Another girl, worried, ran over. After confirming that Ga-eun was fine, she boldly suggested calling a school violence committee meeting. Choi Mi-ra was very annoyed, claiming that living in a slum, they had no right to act self-righteous. The girl sneered. Choi Mi-ra's family was indeed wealthy, but she couldn't beat her academically and looked even more pitiful. Enraged, Choi Mi-ra and the girl started pulling each other's hair. Choi Mi-ra pushed too hard, sending the girl tumbling down a slope. The girl rolled down and hit her head on a rock. Everyone was terrified. They approached to check on her. The girl lay motionless. Choi Mi-ra, kneeling, pushed her and concluded she was dead. Panicking, she covered the body with dry leaves. Looking up, she found Ga-eun about to call the police. She quickly snatched the phone away and threatened her not to call. The next day, Choi Mi-ra had found out that Ga-eun had called the police and severely scolded her. At the same time, Young Min was printing missing person posters for the girl. Just as he was distributing them in the park, he suddenly received a call from the boy. The police had found the sister's backpack and a suicide note. Young Min hurried to the scene where the police were retrieving a body. Reading the suicide note on the phone, Ji-hyun sensed something was wrong. She had seen the notes the girl left for her brother, always signed as brother's sister, but this note only mentioned sister, and the phone wasn't locked, as if meant to be seen. It was clearly a staged scene. Meanwhile, Ga-eun was lost in thought over spicy noodles, remembering the girl's kindness towards her and feeling guilty. While feeling remorseful, she received another call from the boy. At the same time, Young Min and Ji-hyun were at a deadlock. The police had concluded it was a suicide. They wanted to help but were powerless. Although they knew Choi Mi-ra was cunning, they were helpless without evidence. Just as they were despairing, they found Ga-eun waiting at the boy's house. While a school beauty was bullying the girl, another girl approached and threw a full cup of coffee on the bully. The bullied girl was stunned. This was Ga-eun's desperate counterattack. She had had enough of Choi Mi-ra's disgusting antics and threatened her with hot coffee next time. Afterward, she took the bullied girl away from there. The counterattack did not end there. She told the two from the ghost taxi that Choi Mi-ra had indeed killed someone and hid the body on the school hill. They hurried there. If the girl was really murdered, she would become a ghost due to resentment. But regardless of their calls, there was no response, suggesting the girl might still be alive. In a rush, Young Min nearly fell down a slope, but a strange force surged into his palm and Ji-hyun managed to grab him. They were shocked by everything. A voice sounded nearby and Ji-hyun teleported over. The girl was there, still breathing but cold as ice. They immediately took her to the hospital. Dr. Do-gyu-jin tried his best to revive her. While they anxiously waited, the grandmother and the boy finally arrived. Young Min explained the situation to the grandmother, who was so worried she nearly fainted. The girl's heart stopped, but Dr. Do-gyu-jin did not give up. Despite his efforts, her heartbeat did not return. The nurse called the grandmother aside. Just as she left, the sister's spirit appeared. All three were unable to accept this. The girl tearfully thanked them. Without them, she could never see her brother again. Her wish was to see him once more and wish him a happy birthday. After fulfilling her wish, she disappeared. The boy cried uncontrollably, and Young Min could only hold him tightly. Even though Dr. Do-gyu-jin fought hard, he had to face reality. But just as he gave up, a miracle occurred. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The next day, the girl woke up. The grandmother was very grateful to Young Min for saving her granddaughter's life. She tried to give him a stack of money, which he did not accept, knowing the family was not well off. The boy hugged Young Min tightly. Ga-eun entered the hospital room feeling very guilty, but the girl did not blame her. She took out mixed noodles from her bag, a sweet memory for both. With the girl safe, Choi Mi-ra was sent to a correctional school. It was a perfect ending. In their spare time, Young Min devoted all his attention to Ji-hyun. He not only changed her mattress to an ultra-soft one, but also improved her workstation using his grandmother's skills. Together, they enjoyed the fresh scent, the air filled with the sour smell of love. She thought of what Kim Sin-woo had said before. If she fell in love with Young Min, love would replace her resentment, and she would ascend to heaven. But just at that moment, Young Min started his confession. He wanted to hang a love lock at Namsan with his girlfriend and wished to go with Ji-hyun. Ji-hyun immediately rejected him, saying she was already dead. Dead and living people could have no future together. Still, Ji-hyun ended up at Namsan with him. Seeing Young Min about to draw a heart, she quickly refused. As they were not a couple, Young Min wouldn't listen. A man hanging a love lock alone drew laughter from those around. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Do Gyu-jin coincidentally passed by. Ji-hyun remembered she had once sought treatment from him and even asked him out. Young Min quickly showed the doctor a photo of a girl, and the doctor recognized her. While Byung-chil was working, he suddenly saw an 80-year-old grandmother by the roadside and rushed over to question her. The grandmother became flustered upon seeing Young Min and stuttered without knowing how to explain. Angry, Young Min worried about her health deteriorating at such an age. The grandmother said she was busy and they would talk at home. She then bashfully greeted an old man across the street. Young Min noticed this and was at a loss for words. Despite her embarrassment, Young Min had no choice but to stay with her until work ended. That evening, he urged her to quit her job, fearing she might faint again. However, the grandmother outright refused. When Young Min asked if she was dating, she angrily stood up and left, promising to quit her job. Ji-hyun couldn't stand it and didn't understand why he was angry with his grandmother. Elderly people also have the right to pursue their happiness. Young Min knew deep down that his grandmother wanted to earn money to help ease his financial burden. The immediate crisis was averted after paying off the interest, but repaying the principal was not easy. Ji-hyun worried for him upon hearing this. It seemed the ghost taxi would never cease operation. Yesterday, from Dr. Do Gyu-jin, Ji-hyun learned that she had indeed been a police detective before her death and thought it was cool. She returned home, imagining fighting with villains. In her room, she discovered Young Min researching her online. Ji-hyun was touched, yet it was strange that there were no reports of a female detective's death online. The next day, Young Min took Ji-hyun to the police station. He wanted her family information because her death and his mother's were on the same day. The police refused him, rightly saying Ji-hyun's family had just come to terms with her passing. She couldn't reappear and disturb them. Young Min, not wanting to see Ji-hyun hurt, then approached Hwa Gongja to ask what spirits liked. Hwa Gongja was furious, but then thought it might be a good thing. If Ji-hyun fell in love with Young Min, her love would dissolve her resentment, allowing her to ascend to heaven. No wonder Ji-hyun had refused his confession. She had known all along. Ji-hyun hadn't regained her memory, and he couldn't let his feelings cause her to leave. So he decided to bury his feelings completely. The next day, he was deliberately cold to Ji-hyun and left without her. A man then stopped a taxi, but as soon as he sat down, he noticed an old lady in the passenger seat. Thinking it was a shared ride, the driver quickly explained that the woman was his mother with Alzheimer's, forcing him to work with her. The man also recalled a TV report about a driver working with his demented mother. He thought it was just a normal ride, but the passenger was truly disgusting, saying old people should just die. The driver couldn't tolerate it anymore. He stopped the car and sternly told the man to get out. She couldn't carry such a passenger. The driver completely disregarded the consequences of refusing a fare. She yelled at the man to get out of the car. The mother nearby was terrified. She didn't know why her daughter was so angry. The man complained to the taxi company. Shouting, he demanded the manager come out. A woman gently comforted the frightened mother. Wang Mao, hearing the commotion, rushed over. He represented the company. The man angrily pointed at the woman. The driver allowed sharing but then refused my ride. Because of her, I missed an important business meeting, he claimed, threatening to sue her for financial losses. This is clearly bullying an honest person. Wang Mao didn't care about the man's threats. He had seen the dashcam footage. It showed the man saying many unethical things. He planned to post the video on social media. The man became scared. Being a businessman, he knew exposure would lead to boycotts. He would surely go bankrupt. At this point, the man could only sincerely apologize. The kind woman forgave him. Meanwhile, Young Min, hiding his feelings for Ji-hyun, left her and went to the hospital. He asked Jo-ri about Ji-hyun's cause of death. Jo-ri said she was brought to the ER that day, treated, and then moved to the ICU, where she died from cardiac arrest. Young Min thanked her, then asked for Ji-hyun's family's contact details. Jo-ri refused to disclose patient information without thinking, That night, back home, Ji-hyun looked unhappy. She asked Young Min where he had been. Young Min lied about handling an urgent matter and apologized. He said he had forgotten his phone and blamed her for being aggressive. Ji-hyun was speechless. She thought about it all day. Though unclear about those fragmented memories, all clues pointed to the hospital. She wanted Young Min to accompany her there. Young Min had just returned from there. No matter what Ji-hyun said, he refused to move, deliberately using a cold tone. Ji-hyun was heartbroken. Seeing Ji-hyun cry, Young Min panicked. Eventually, Young Min took her to the hospital. At the same time, the drivers gathered together. An uncle claimed he had seen a ghost. The three others laughed. The man with a middle part boldly challenged, "If there are ghosts, let them show up." He took over the night shift from another man. Soon, he spotted a female passenger roadside. He stopped to pick her up, but she teleported into the car. A puff of smoke caught her attention. In the next second, the smoke formed into a man. The two were shocked. They had seen many spirits, but this was a first for such an entrance. Curly said he wasn't a malevolent spirit. He stayed because he had someone he wanted to meet, having been there for 5 years. Ji-hyun was delighted because he knew the hospital inside out. Curly recognized them as the famous ghost taxi, known among spirits for fulfilling their wishes. Broke, he asked them to help fulfill his wish. Ji-hyun immediately refused. Young Min was deep in debt. They wouldn't engage in a losing business. Curly offered hospital information in exchange. Young Min immediately agreed. Ji-hyun was confused. Young Min told her, "Drive the ghost taxi and pay off the debt slowly. You are what matters most." They struck a deal. Curly shared his wish. He wanted to find his daughter, Sarah. After his wife's death, Curly raised her alone, which was harder than expected. He left her with his sister due to work commitments. Suddenly one day, she went abroad to study without telling him, her father. That's when he realized how much resentment she must have harbored. Now she wasn't even in contact with his sister. Curly hoped they could help find Sarah, but they only had her childhood photo. Finding her would not be easy. Curly mentioned another clue. He was a detective before he died. His partner seemed to know how to contact Sarah. They hurried to the police station. Unfortunately, the officer was on vacation. They couldn't get the contact information. Young Min had no choice but to leave his mobile number. Elsewhere, 2 car accident victims were rushed to the hospital. The doctors immediately attempted to resuscitate them. However, despite their efforts, the man's heart stopped beating. His soul left his body. Seeing the woman next to him unconscious, he was extremely worried. They had just gotten married today. He wanted the doctors to save his wife. Unexpectedly, a doctor walked right through him. Before he could react, the doctor pronounced him dead. He couldn't believe it. They had just married after much difficulty. He tried to hold his wife's hand, but grasped only air. He wept helplessly. This whole scene was witnessed by others. The love in his heart dissolved all resentment. The man vanished on the spot. Back home, Ji-hyun realized everything. Young Min was cold and didn't bring his phone because he was afraid he would disappear. Ji-hyun admitted she too kept her distance for the same reason. But today, after seeing the newlyweds, she understood that even if they loved each other so much, they would eventually part. Ji-hyun told Young Min she wanted him to always be by her side. Young Min naturally agreed. From that moment, they decided to live without regrets. That night, Ji-hyun kept thinking about their kissing scene, happiness written all over her face. Young Min couldn't sleep, regretting that his confession wasn't cool enough. Neither slept all night. Today was their first date. Young Min dressed up neatly. His grandmother noticed right away. Reluctantly, Young Min admitted he had a girlfriend. Upon hearing about the date, his grandmother was more excited than if she were going on a date herself. She immediately helped him dress up. She took out a long stored toner and patted it on Young Min's face vigorously. Then she styled his hair into a greasy middle part, which was quite unattractive. She changed it to a more fashionable style. Seeing his clueless look, they shook their heads until they settled on a straight fringe. Regarding his outfit, his grandmother had him wear his most expensive clothes. When Young Min walked out the door, he was very nervous. Ji-hyun held back her laughter. Although speechless, she was very happy inside. After all, Young Min wanted to make a good impression. She didn't ask him to change, but slightly adjusted his look. She tucked his collar in, took out a pocket square, and his grandfather's leather belt. Young Min was thrilled. He had finally found a girlfriend, though she was a pet from his car. Young Min spent the whole night planning the best date. Knowing he was financially strapped, Ji-hyun insisted on going to the Han River. Young Min was not happy, despite it being a very important day. Ji-hyun told him to cheer up. Having such an understanding girlfriend was a blessing he must have earned in a past life. While walking, Young Min insisted on holding hands. Ji-hyun tried, but it didn't work. They had managed to hold hands before. Ji-hyun thought she hadn't adjusted her state properly, so she focused deeply and tried again. But it was still the same. Failing to hold hands on the first day of dating felt like a huge failure. Hwa Gongjia had said, "Spirits in love ascend to heaven." Why wasn't Ji-hyun affected? Young Min felt she didn't truly love him. Neither of them backed down, resulting in a big argument. The sweet atmosphere was instantly shattered. Both returned home unhappy. Grandma finally waited for Young Min to return. She asked him excitedly how his date went. Young Min said it was uninteresting because the girl doubted his sincerity. Ji-hyun felt the same and went straight back to her room. Grandma felt helpless. After all this time, he finally went on a date. But it ended like this. Then, Young Min met with Hwa Gongjia and asked why Ji-hyun, having fallen in love, did not ascend to heaven. Hwa Gongjia suggested 3 possibilities. They were not truly in love. She was a powerful evil spirit incapable of love. Or she existed beyond the spiritual realm. Young Min wanted to ask more, but a dark cloud suddenly attacked. To help a ghost find her lost daughter, a ghost taxi brought the spirit to a cafe. A police officer was invited there. Ji-hyun froze, and on seeing the officer, she burst into tears, her heart aching immensely. With no memory of her past, how could she know that this officer was her biological father? Ji-hyun couldn't bear it. She went through the window and appeared next to the car in the next second. Young Min, sensing something was wrong, asked the officer to wait and approached Ji-hyun with concern. Seeing Ji-hyun gasping for breath, Young Min told her to rest. He returned to the table where Curly, his former partner, was crying inconsolably. Young Min wanted to repay Curly and asked about his daughter's whereabouts. Curly echoed this, hoping he could help find his daughter, Sarah. The officer said Sarah was living in the US, making a meeting impossible. Just as Curly was saddened, the officer added that Sarah was actually in Korea, having learned this from the news. Curly was thrilled, knowing he would meet his daughter the next day. In return, he revealed a secret about the hospital. A nurse had placed very dangerous drugs in a locker. Curly didn't divulge more, but Ji-hyun sensed it was a crucial clue. The next day, the 2 people and 2 ghosts attended a robotics seminar. Curly finally met his daughter. After the meeting, he approached her eagerly. How could Sarah see her father, a spirit? The officer greeted her, and Sarah recognized this uncle but was unfriendly. When Young Min mentioned her father, Sarah cut him off, saying she didn't want to hear anything about him and prepared to leave. The officer stopped her and handed her a USB drive that her father carried daily, saying if it were to be lost, it should be by her hand. After saying this, the officer left. Young Min stopped him and revealed that her father's spirit was here. Sarah, a scientist, didn't believe him. Young Min apologized on Curly's behalf, regretting not being able to give her the strawberry cake she liked. Sarah turned and left but believed Young Min's words. She went to a secluded spot to open the USB drive, filled with memories of her and her father. At that moment, her resentment vanished. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Curly was filled with self-reproach. His daughter held resentment towards him. He didn't feel like a father. The next day, the group returned to the venue. Curly decided to leave, satisfied seeing his accomplished grown-up daughter. But then, danger struck. Sparks flew overhead as a spotlight fell directly towards her. The woman was unharmed, and the man anxiously asked if she saw it, but she couldn't see because her father's spirit had saved her. The accident made her feel her father's presence, perhaps showing he wasn't as heartless as she had imagined. The next day, she took the initiative to meet with Young Min. They met at the columbarium. Looking at the family portrait in the cabinet and the first prize-winning piece beside it, Sarah asked Young Min if their father was also with them now. After receiving a positive response, Sarah told their father that she had once resented and disliked him, the old USB he carried, the robot in the cabinet, and his action of saving her yesterday, which finally made her understand. Yet Sarah still didn't understand if work was really that important that he had to leave her in their aunt's care. From now on, she would no longer hold any grudges against him. Curly was inconsolable, expressing his gratitude and love to his daughter. After giving her a final hug, his soul was finally liberated and disappeared on the spot. Sarah sensed something and couldn't help but burst into tears. That evening, they went to the hospital. With Jo Ree's help, they checked the nurse's locker but found no dangerous drugs, as Curly had mentioned. To investigate Ji-hyun's origins, they visited Kim Jong-woo's home. They arrived only to see a mysterious woman at the door, her transparent legs revealing she was not human. As they walked past, the woman opened the day and asked them to help find Kim Jong-woo. Her legs restored, and a face without features startled Young Min. Inside, they found the woman's body. She didn't remember how she died, but was sure Kim Jong-woo hadn't killed her, as he had always been kind to her. She hoped they could help find Kim Jong-woo. Otherwise, she couldn't leave. The bedroom wall was covered with photos taken at the columbarium, including Ji-hyun and Young Min's photos in the upper left corner. At that moment, they concluded that Kim Jong-woo was the murderer of Ji-hyun and Young Min's mother. Meanwhile, a police officer approached Ji-hyun's hospital bed. She was still alive. Suddenly, Ji-hyun's body exhibited strange symptoms and her soul sensed something wrong. Her image began flickering, terrifying her boyfriend, who thought she was ascending to heaven. Unbeknownst to them, a woman was lying in a hospital bed nearby, her body convulsing. Her father quickly called a doctor who stabilized her with a sedative. At the same time, Ji-hyun's soul returned to normal. Another spirit named Mi-gyong approached. She had been the lady of the room and was curious about the photos on the wall, which were evidence of Kim Jong-woo's murders. She had cleaned the day before her death and had never seen these photos before. She insisted they had nothing to do with Kim Jong-woo. As Young Min was about to call the police, a woman arrived, recognizing Young Min as she was the head nurse at the hospital. Curious about why Young Min was coming out of that room, she entered and found Mi-gyong's body on the floor. The police controlled the scene and took Young Min to the station as a suspect. Ji-hyun blamed herself for his plight, as he was only helping her investigate the murderer. Young Min reassured her not to worry, as he had done nothing, and the police would release him soon. He was happy to be with his beloved girlfriend. Ji-hyun thought he was joking, but Young Min seriously said, being with her, he wouldn't mind even going to hell. Ji-hyun laughed, agreeing without hesitation. During the interrogation, Young Min was assisted by Ji-hyun, a legal expert and detective, and he answered smoothly. He heard rumors of Kim Jong-woo assaulting someone at the hospital, which led him to suspect Kim as his mother's killer. Wanting to check Kim's house, he instead found Mi-gyong dead there. The police couldn't extract any useful clues and released Young Min the next day, after forensic results showed Mi-gyong had been dead for over a week, and Young Min's fingerprints were not on the syringe, clearing his suspicions. As he was leaving, a photo of Ji-hyun on the wall caught his eye. The obscured part was that of the previous officer. Ji-hyun broke down in tears. The woman lay comatose in the hospital, her soul wandering the earth, amnesiac, and now a mascot for a ghost taxi. The owner sought to help her regain as many memories as possible and found Ji-hyun's father, an officer who did not trust Young Min. Young Min, straightforward, revealed his mother had been a taxi driver, killed by a hit-and-run motorcycle on April 12th, the same day Ji-hyun died. To prove his connection to Ji-hyun, Young Min showed photos of Ji-hyun and his mother, feeling both cases were linked. Although the police focused on Kim Jong-woo as a suspect, Young Min felt something was amiss and stated he had no evidence yet, wanting to know more about Ji-hyun's death. The officer, blunt, said he couldn't trust Young Min yet and needed time to consider revealing the truth about his daughter being alive. Meanwhile, the police sensed something off as the evidence against Kim Jong-woo seemed too perfect and staged. Mi-gyong then insisted Kim Jong-woo was not the killer, urging Ji-hyun not to let emotions cloud her judgment, as sometimes those closest to us are the strangest. Even after her death, Mi-gyong defended Kim Jong-woo, whose injection technique clearly differed from the real culprits. Finding Kim Jong-woo was urgent to clear the confusion. Ji-hyun asked where he might be hiding, leading Mi-gyong to a secluded villa often visited by them and owned by the head nurse. Despite its remote location, the villa was valuable. Ji-hyun noted the head nurse must have a good background, but Mi-gyong revealed she grew up in an orphanage, hinting at secrets. The locked villa revealed nothing after a search by the two spirits, while Young Min waited outside. Mi-gyong cherished the place where Kim Jong-woo celebrated his birthday on the day of the hit and run, Caught off guard, they realized someone else was involved as a camera captured everything. At the hospital, Dr. Do-gyujin ominously watched his phone as the demented mother of a female driver, renowned for her filial piety on TV, woke up from a simple fall. Dr. Do-gyujin, with a sinister smile, considered murder after talking to the female driver about her mother's hospitalization for observation. Comforted by the driver, he resolved to kill. That night, dressed in leather, he ignored the head nurse's warnings. The next day, Young Min informed the police of his suspicions about the head nurse. Despite growing up in an orphanage, she owned a villa. She now lived in a rental apartment and resided on the same floor as Kim Jong-woo. The police concluded that Kim Jong-woo and the head nurse might be accomplices. At that moment, Young Min received a call. The female driver's demented mother had passed away. They immediately went to the funeral. There, Ji-hyun unexpectedly saw Dr. Do-gyujin's sinister smile. When he looked again, Dr. Do-gyujin appeared saddened. Meanwhile, to further investigate his daughter's death, the officer followed another officer to the detective's location. Their knocking went unanswered. Upon pushing the door open, they found the detective had already died. The murderer was none other than Dr. Do-gyujin. At the funeral of the demented woman, Kang Ji-hyun looked around and noticed that the aunt's spirit did not appear. They remarked on the strange circumstances of the aunt's death. She had accidentally fallen in the bathroom, suffered a concussion, but ultimately died of a myocardial infarction. Recalling Dr. Do-gyujin's eerie smirk, they felt something was amiss. As they left, they discovered the aunt's spirit sitting in the car. Rushing over, the aunt expressed a desire to see her daughter. Young Min brought the female driver to the car, telling her that her mother's spirit was there. The driver was skeptical and thought it was a tasteless joke. As she was about to leave, Young Min mentioned the song, "You Are My True Love," which the driver had sung solo at their high school reunion. Half believing, the driver wondered if her deceased mother was really there. The demented mother then mentioned that the driver had chosen her favorite song to perform, but had missed it due to work, causing days of silence between them. Just like before, the mother sat in the passenger seat of the taxi. Alzheimer's had robbed her of her memories, but her spiritual form remembered everything. Her daughter had tirelessly worked with her for many years. The mother said she was incredibly happy and made her final request, from now on, to live for herself and ensure her own happiness. The driver agreed, and during their last drive together, the mother's wish was fulfilled, and she joyfully disappeared. Upon returning home, they found Dr. Do-gyujin waiting with Grandma's blood pressure medication. Young Min was grateful, but Ji-hyun remained suspicious. Dr. Do-gyujin, emerging from the bathroom unnoticed, began searching for something. Ji-hyun saw him enter Young Min's room and followed. Young Min was drawn by her shouting. Confronted, Dr. Do-gyujin explained he entered because the door was open. His gaze kept returning to the charging cable on the desk. Seizing the moment, Young Min brought up his suspicions about the head nurse. Hearing Young Min had no evidence, Dr. Do-gyujin defended the head nurse as honest and kind, incapable of crime. After he left, Ji-hyun declared him suspicious. With no time for baseless guesses, they visited Kim Jong-woo's home again. Mi-gyung mentioned that Kim Jong-woo had panicked after seeing a sticky note and rushed out. Searching quickly, they found the note hidden in a stack of old newspapers. "If you need help, come to me." Just as they stepped out, the murderer of Kang Ji-hyun approached. Unaware of her identity at the moment, they were cautious. The murderer was about to leave when Young Min stopped her. The head nurse looked puzzled but invited him inside. Young Min asked about her relationship with Kim Jong-woo. Confused, she retorted that he was not a police officer and had no right to question her. Young Min was left speechless. As he was about to drink coffee, a memory flashed through Ji-hyun's mind. Young Min immediately put down the cup and left the room. The head nurse's face was expressionless, as she knew Young Min had grown suspicious of her and wanted to silence him. However, her plan failed. After leaving, Ji-hyun returned to the room because one's true nature is often revealed when alone. Indeed, the head nurse was anxiously looking at a keychain and a photo in her bag. Ji-hyun informed Young Min about this. At that moment, a detective called, reporting that another detective who had been taking photographs at the columbarium had died. Fortunately, they discovered a photo on the computer, the same one that was in the head nurse's bag, deepening their suspicion of her. To clarify the situation, Young Min approached Jo-ri, who immediately recognized the handwriting on a sticky note as the head nurse's. Young Min took a photo and warned Jo-ri to keep this to herself. Dr. Do Gyu-jin witnessed this scene and later asked Jo-ri about it, who gave a vague excuse. However, Dr. Do Gyu-jin sensed something was off and warned the head nurse to be careful. That evening, handwriting analysis confirmed that the handwriting on the sticky note matched the medical records. With the current evidence, the head nurse was the prime suspect. Just as they considered handing over the evidence to the police, Ji-hyun's image flickered but soon stabilized, making her feel like she was about to ascend. Taking a risk, Young Min confronted the head nurse with the sticky note, causing her to panic and admit it belonged to Kim Jong-woo, though she claimed he never came to see her. Young Min, skeptical, showed her the photo of the keychain identical to hers. Unfazed, the head nurse mentioned that all graduates from Daesun University's nursing school had such a keychain, rendering it inconclusive as evidence. Young Min gave her 2 days to reveal Kim Jong-woo's whereabouts, or he would go to the police. Unbeknownst to him, the head nurse harbored murderous intentions. As Young Min reached his doorstep, he was suddenly struck by a blunt object. In a dilapidated warehouse, Young Min regained consciousness due to Ji-hyun's calls. His body was firmly trapped, and nearby lay Kim Jong-woo, already dead. Dr. Do Gyu-jin approached, sitting across and mockingly laughing at Young Min, saying it was not his place to meddle. Otherwise, he'd lose his source of entertainment. Young Min was stunned as all truths were revealed. Earlier, after a dispute with his mother, Young Min had impulsively kicked a taxi and was distracted during class, planning to apologize to his mother, who had texted him to meet for dinner. His spirits lifted at the prospect of reconciliation. Meanwhile, his mother had taken Ji-hyun to a psychology exhibition, lending her a hair tie before leaving. Ji-hyun, investigating her friend's mysterious death at the hospital, approached the head nurse under the guise of discussing psychology. They drank merrily until the head nurse went to fetch more wine, giving Ji-hyun a chance to search for clues. Suddenly, there was noise outside, and a drug left her too weak to resist, barely managing to crawl outside. Dr. Do Gyu-jin approached with a sinister smile, taking out his phone to savor the moment. But Ji-hyun fought back, seizing the phone and striking it before running outside. Meanwhile, Mom is calling Young Min. There are no parking spots at the barbecue restaurant, so she has to wait for Young Min here. While talking, she suddenly spots Ji-hyun running towards her. She catches her just as Dr. Do Gyu-jin, smiling wickedly, appears. Sensing something is wrong, the woman helps Ji-hyun into the car. Just as she is about to drive away, a motorcycle crashes into her. Hearing the crash, Young Min realizes something is wrong and rushes to the scene. He sees his mother lying on the ground, her condition uncertain. Ji-hyun, unable to do anything, faints. Dr. Do Gyu-jin, seeing Ji-hyun unconscious, checks on the woman. The security guard arrives, and Dr. Do Gyu-jin pretends to help. As he is about to act, Young Min arrives. Dr. Do Gyu-jin introduces himself as a doctor. Seeing his mother's dire condition, Young Min decides to trust him. After some emergency aid, the ambulance finally arrives. Young Min tries to get on, but Dr. Do Gyu-jin pulls him off, saying there is no room and tells Young Min to take a taxi to the hospital. Dr. Do Gyu-jin then hurries off. At the taxi, Dr. Do Gyu-jin, unnoticed, injects a drug into the woman's body. Meanwhile, the head nurse drives off with Ji-hyun in Young Min's mom's taxi. Soon, a police officer finds Ji-hyun motionless on the ground. By the time Young Min reaches the hospital, his mother has passed away. To satisfy his perverse desires, Dr. Do Gyu-jin forces Young Min to watch a video of the murder. Ji-hyun loudly scolds him, but Dr. Do Gyu-jin doesn't see her. In their despair, Dr. Do Gyu-jin reveals his next plan. He intends to pin all the serial killings at Daesun Hospital on Kim Jong-woo and his wife Mi-gyong, aiming ultimately at Young Min. Kim Jong-woo brought Young Min here, and due to an accident, both were supposed to die here, making the plan seemingly perfect. Then, Dr. Do Gyu-jin ignites the gasoline on the ground, surrounding Young Min with fire. Ji-hyun, unable to physically interact, desperately throws herself towards Young Min. At that moment, her powers manifest, creating a barrier that the flames cannot penetrate. The police arrive in time and extinguish the fire, saving Young Min. He quickly tells the police the truth, all witnessed by Dr. Do Gyu-jin from a distance. Despite the unbelievable survival of Young Min, Dr. Do-Gyun decides to change his plans. Back home, Ji-hyun feels terribly guilty, believing she caused the death of Young Min's mom. After apologizing to Young Min, she retreats to her room, unsure of how to face him. Hearing her continuous crying, Young Min is heartbroken. Ji-hyun is also a victim and should not hide in self-blame. What's crucial now is to catch the murderer, a task too great for him alone. If Ji-hyun hadn't sacrificed herself, he would have been killed by the fire. This realization comforts Ji-hyun, and they decide to work together to catch the murderer. Meanwhile, the police have gathered information on Dr. Do-Gyun. He has known the head nurse since the 6th grade when she was his grandfather's caregiver. They have been close for nearly 20 years, living together after his grandfather's death. Clearly accomplices. That night, the murderous duo meets outdoors, inadvertently admitting their guilt. Dr. Do-Gyun decides to confront the situation directly, confident in his lack of evidence left behind. Everything is going as he planned. The police arrested him the next day. During the interrogation, he remained calm and composed. Even when Young Min confronted him face to face, Dr. Do-Gyun admitted nothing. With no clear evidence, the police had to let him go. To expose the serial killer, Ji-hyun decided to fix her phone against Young Min's advice, as he had failed in his previous attempt. As the program ran, Ji-hyun's body started to turn transparent, prompting them to quickly ask the technician to stop. Helpless with the evidence so close, Ji-hyun decided to sacrifice herself for justice, which Young Min strongly disagreed with. Out of options, Young Min sought help from Hwa Gong-ja. After casting a spell, a general spirit possessed him and revealed that Ji-hyun controlled the realms of heaven and earth. Tampering with the phone would lead to Ji-hyun's real death, he warned, and then left the body. Confused, they wondered how Ji-hyun, already a ghost, could die again. Hwa Gong-ja, merely a medium for the general's words, suggested that meddling with the phone could bring great peril, possibly even the scattering of the soul. Meanwhile, the serial killer began a new plan by installing a camera in Young Min's car. Puzzled by his frequent hospital visits and his mutterings about finding his own murder evidence, and how he survived a fire, the head nurse shared this suspicion. That night, Dr. Do-Gyun approached Young Min's car, unlocked it with a virus, and hid the camera. The next day, oblivious, Young Min and Ji-hyun got into the car. Dr. Do-Gyun watched them talk, baffled. Young Min went to get a charger, remarking, "This is Ji-hyun's life." Mi Gayong appeared, asking them to take her to Kim Jong-woo. At the warehouse, Kim Jong-woo's spirit was indeed there, and the couple reunited as spirits. Young Min told him about Dr. Do-Gyun's actions, blaming him for everything. Enraged, Kim Jong-woo turned into a vengeful spirit. Mi Gayong stopped him, not wanting her kind lover to kill or to part again. Her love calmed his vengeful spirit, and Young Min promised to make Dr. Do-Gyun and the head nurse pay. Believing him, Kim Jong-woo revealed that he had recorded the head nurse's crime and sent it to his grandmother. After thanking them, Mi Gayong and her lover ascended to heaven, hand in hand. Young Min obtained the recording and hurriedly handed it to the police. Unbeknownst to them, Dr. Do-Gyun had seen everything through the surveillance. When they went to confront him, he had vanished. Puzzled by his disappearance and how he knew of their plans, Young Min suddenly realized something and found a camera hidden in his car, which Dr. Do-Gyun saw. Furious, Young Min smashed the camera. To find Dr. Do-Gyun, Young Min returned to the head nurse's home, pulling out Ji-hyun's possessed phone, certain it contained vital evidence. He decided to hand it to the police the next day, believing they would unlock it and find clues. The head nurse panicked and finally showed her true intentions, vowing that she would not let Young Min touch Dr. Do-Gyun. Young Min didn't beat around the bush, stating that she was just a puppet of Dr. Do-Gyun, a mere tool filled with his murderous desires. The head nurse laughed it off because Young Min didn't understand the depth of Dr. Do-Gyun's feelings for her, which had long surpassed familial ties. After Young Min left, the head nurse drove off in a panic, clearly aiming to inform Dr. Do-Gyun. Young Min and Ji-hyun quickly followed, and both cars ended up at an abandoned warehouse. The head nurse urged Dr. Do-Gyun to flee because his phone, containing incriminating videos, was about to be handed over to the police by Young Min. Unperturbed, Dr. Do Gyujin asked the head nurse to retrieve a USB drive holding the original files. Although worried, the head nurse complied and left. To prevent Dr. Do Gyujin from escaping, Young Min burst in. Upon seeing his adversary, Dr. Do Gyujin swung a metal rod at him. Without a weapon, Young Min was at a disadvantage and was knocked to the ground. Taking the opportunity, Dr. Do Gyujin grabbed the phone. In the struggle, Young Min accidentally knocked the battery out. Ji-hyun vanished on the spot. Trying to unlock the phone, Young Min found himself in another predicament, and after a beating, the phone was taken again by Dr. Do Gyujin. As he turned on the phone, a strange current surged through him, revealing Ji-hyun. Knowing Young Min's affection for Ji-hyun, Dr. Do Gyujin placed the phone over a stove. Young Min panicked, knowing his lover's life was in another's hands. He knelt down, apologizing profusely. Dr. Do Gyujin delighted in seeing Young Min's pain. After taunting him, he threw the phone into the furnace. As the phone exploded, Ji-hyun's disappearance seemed imminent until the police arrived and arrested him. Seeing Young Min crying on the ground, the police were baffled. At the hospital, nurses mentioned Young Min only had superficial injuries. Thinking he was just shocked, an officer comforted him. As he was leaving, Young Min stopped him, revealing that his daughter's spirit had always been by his side, though Ji-hyun had kept him from telling her father. Blaming himself, Young Min promised to protect Ji-hyun, but failed. The officer, unmoved, took Young Min to a secret hospital where Ji-hyun lay alive, her death faked by Detective Kang to protect her. Overjoyed, Young Min cared for her until she woke up and grabbed his hand. Meanwhile, the police interrogated Dr. Do Gyujin, who staunchly denied everything, until the head nurse arrived at the station, confessing to being the serial killer at Decent Hospital. She revealed a phone used for the crimes and other evidence, insisting Dr. Do Gyujin was innocent. With no evidence against him, the police released Dr. Do Gyujin. The final plan between him and the head nurse was evident. Later, the head nurse was found in her cell, having committed suicide, leaving a note confessing to being a serial killer, ready to face eternal damnation. The news left the police frustrated by the lack of conclusive evidence. That day, a nurse informed Dr. Do Gyujin that a woman, previously declared dead, was alive and well in their hospital. Confused yet determined, Dr. Do Gyujin decided to kill her again. He took the potion from the drawer, sat in front of the hospital bed, and cheerfully said that he was happy to bring her despair again. Just as he was about to inject her, Ji-hyun suddenly stopped him. Young Min ran out from behind to stop him. It was then that Dr. Do Gyujin realized he had fallen into a trap. He kicked Young Min away, picked up a vase to smash at Ji-hyun, but luckily, Young Min blocked it just in time. Dr. Do Gyujin quickly took the chance to flee. By then, the police had surrounded the area. Seeing this, he took Jo-ri hostage and brought her to the garage. He stopped a car, threw Jo-ri onto the driver, and drove away. After confirming Jo-ri was unharmed, Young Min quickly followed, with the police close behind. However, they had to stop at an intersection due to heavy traffic. Fortunately, Young Min kept up and immediately updated the police on their location, giving them a window to act. They set up a roadblock ahead. With no way out, Dr. Do Gyujin was about to be shot by the police when Young Min stepped in front of him. Dr. Do Gyujin slammed on the brakes and crashed into the roadblock. The police approached to check the situation. Just as they opened the car door, Dr. Do Gyujin pulled a syringe on them, but Young Min rushed out to stop him, determined not to let this villain die so easily. If he has to die, he must first pay for his crimes, he declared. The murderer was finally arrested. In the hospital, after treating his wounds, Ji-hyun and Young Min approached Dr. Do Gyujin, who was utterly confused and asked if she was a human or a ghost. Even now, Dr. Do Gyujin was still threatening to kill them both, vowing revenge even in death. It seems his scope of knowledge had broadened, but he was mistaken in thinking he would die. Instead, he would spend centuries in prison atoning for his sins. 2 days earlier, Ji-hyun had woken up in the hospital bed, remembering everything that happened when she was a spirit. Now that the head nurse had taken Dr. Do Gyujin's place in confessing, they couldn't let him get away with his crimes, so they devised this plan, which fortunately was successfully completed. In prison, the ghostly Dr. Do Gyujin was haunted by the vicious desperados still roaming the jail as evil spirits. From now on, it would be hard for Dr. Do Gyujin to have a peaceful sleep. The next day, Ji-hyun returned to her duties as a police officer. The police chief didn't rush to assign her tasks but allowed her a day to rest. Delighted, planned to take her daughter out for a big meal, but Ji-hyun mentioned she had a date to meet the spirit of her deceased mother. Young Min took Ji-hyun to Hwa Gongja's house, where Hwa Gongja channeled the spirit who said she had been unable to leave because she was keeping a promise made before her death to take her son to eat barbecue. So her spirit waited at the barbecue restaurant. Young Min rushed there and indeed found his mother's spirit, who had been waiting a long time. Surprised that her son could see her, she was not upset about the wait. Trying to wipe away her son's tears but unable to touch him, she could only watch him with a heart full of sorrow. Then Ji-hyun came over, no longer able to see spirits. Young Min relayed that his mother was right there. Ji-hyun finally broke down and apologized to Young Min's mother. If not for her, Young Min's mother would not have met with an accident and could have lived happily with Young Min and his grandmother. The woman didn't blame her and told her not to feel guilty because it wasn't her fault. After realizing this, the mother asked Young Min how he came to be with Ji-hyun. In the restaurant, Young Min explained recent events to his mother, and Ji-hyun also expressed her feelings. The mother's biggest concern was always Young Min. Today, Ji-hyun's words finally set her mind at ease. Coming to eat barbecue was a promise between mother and son. She had always said she would bring Young Min here, but it was too expensive, so she kept delaying. Her mother felt very guilty, so she kept waiting there. Now, seeing Young Min eating so deliciously, she was truly happy. With her wish fulfilled, it was time for her to ascend to heaven. In the end, Mom told Young Min, "You are my pride, and the reason I lived. I am happy because of you." She had no regrets left. After saying this, her soul disappeared on the spot. That day, Young Min introduced his grandmother to his wife. For some reason, his grandmother took an immediate liking to her, as if she had always been by her side. In the final chapter, Young Min began assisting Ji-hyun with her cases because he could see ghosts. He also started running a ghost taxi service on the side.